Hi, welcome to Quartertone Harmony. I'm Kurt, and in this episode, I'm going to talk about one absolutely amazing quartertone chord. When I first started working with quartertones, I quickly found, as I showed in my first episode, that conventional wisdom was wrong, what you might call microtonal wisdom is right, and you can make good chords using quartertones. But using those chords was a different matter. Almost everything I tried sounded bad. Even when it sounded okay, it wasn't different and better than 12th tone. So what was the point? But stubbornness runs in my family, and so I kept trying different chords and different combinations. After a while, I was working on the idea that field shifts were smoother when they were done in small steps. I came up with the idea of having a harmonic 13th on 6, followed by a 9/15 chord on 7, and then a tonic triad, partly because this enabled almost exclusively small shifts, and partly because it's a really obvious progression. And success! Finally something that sounded good. Pretty smooth, but with a kind of bite to it you can't get from 12th tone. Time to figure out how it worked. The first thing I figured out was I goofed. I had done that middle chord a semitone low. It's actually the 9/15 for flat 7. Well, the progression still works. Flat 7 makes sense because it's a dominant, but flat 7 in this case doesn't really capture the spirit of the progression. While I continued to puzzle on that, I noticed that the notes for this chord were exactly the same as the notes for harmonic 13th on E half flat, the 10th degree. At the time, I didn't know that the 10th degree could function as a dominant. Now I know that it can, and the 10th degree does indeed capture most of the spirit of that progression. So, mystery solved, or so I thought. That chord works because it's functioning as a dominant two different ways. As a 9/15 chord on flat 7, and more importantly, as a 10th degree as a harmonic 13th. But what about that first chord? It sounds predominant from the way that progression sounds, but 6? Since when is the 6th degree predominant? So that stymied me for a while, until one day I was sitting in the grocery store parking lot, and it just occurred to me, maybe it's an altered 12-tone chord. So I looked at it, and lo and behold, if you raise the 11th and the 13th by a quarter tone, you get a diminished 7th chord. And that chord is indeed a reasonable substitute here, if a little less tasty. A diminished 7th chord is usually best thought of as a minor dominant ninth missing its root. But because of the many tempered commas in 12th tone, it can be any of 4 different such chords on the roots of the notes, one semitone below the actual notes of the chord. In this case, A half flat, B, D, and F. Aha! D and F are the predominants in this key. So that chord works as a predominant because it's a microtonally altered version of the diminished 7th for both the predominants in the key. Mystery solved. Or is it? Because we can do the same thing to the second chord in the sequence. And that becomes the diminished 7th for A half flat, the 13th degree, C half flat, the 15th degree, D half sharp, the 9th degree, and F half sharp, the 11th degree. All of which I showed in my second episode can have dominant function. Unsurprisingly, that chord does work pretty well if you use it as a substitute. So, that chord wasn't acting as a dominant 2 different ways. It was acting as a dominant 3 different ways. No wonder it has so much zing to it. And that raises another issue. There are 4 harmonic 13th chords that could be altered versions this way of any given diminished 7th. Can they all work as substitutes? Let's test it. We'll take our standard test progression, but here using a diminished 7th for the dominant. And now use each of the harmonic 13ths in a row as a substitute. All clearly dominant. But there's more, because remember there's also that diminished seventh on the other field for the 9th, 11th, 13th, and 15th degrees. Well, that brings 4 more harmonic 13ths. But we're still not done, because there's also a diminished seventh for the 10th, 12th, and 14th degrees. And that brings 4 more harmonic 13ths. So that's 12 different harmonic 13th chords that can function as a dominant for any particular key, plus all the uses of a harmonic 13th chord on their roots, and all the uses of a harmonic 13th chord as a 9/15 chord. That's just crazy to get all that out of one chord. It's nuts. It's still not the whole story, because just as we can alter the 11th and 13th up to get a diminished 7th chord, we can alter the 3rd and root down to get a different diminished 7th chord on the other field even. And that brings 4 more harmonic 7ths working as the 5th degree, 4 more harmonic 7ths working as the 9th, and so on, and 4 more working as the 10th, and so on. I'm not going to play these all because it gets kind of repetitive to key these things over and over again. But if you don't believe me, go test them for yourself, because trust me, they all work. So to see what's going on here, I think I'm going to go to a spreadsheet. Here's a spreadsheet with all the ways I've thought of so far for a harmonic 13th to act as a dominant in the key of C. 11 ways on its own root, both ways on all the circles, plus the 15th degree. 11 more ways as a 9/15 chord on those roots. 12 ways as a altered diminished 7th by changing the 11th and 13th, and 12 more ways as an altered diminished 7th by changing the root and 3rd. There's actually more functions than there are even chords to have them, so there's a lot of overlap. There's a total of 46 uses here. We can see which harmonic 13ths have some kind of use by adding up the rows. Only one of them has no use at all. The others vary from 1 to 4. By just dumb luck, I picked one with more than average. And it's a good thing that I made that mistake, because if I'd done what I originally intended to do, I would have gotten the chord for E half sharp, which only has one use. Not nearly as good. I'm sure you saying, I bet the harmonic 13th chord is really good for Transfield modulations. And you'd be right. But first, I want to show how the flexible, many-factored uses of this chord allow you to create some real interesting ambiguity without any Transfield modulations going on. We now know a harmonic 13th chord can be a microtonally altered version of 2 different diminished 7th chords, a quarter tone apart from one another. Let's construct a progression where either of those diminished 7ths could be in there. So we'll start with 4, 5, and C. One continuation could be to the diminished 7th on 14, which would be for A half sharp. That puts us on the circle of 7ths reversed on our way back to the tonic C. Another way would be a false cadence leading to A, again here as a diminished 7th chord. We could continue with that as a Mario cadence, getting us to B, B minor to make this one a little more interesting. There are 4 harmonic 13th chords that could be microtonally altered versions of either one. Of these, I picked B half flat because that avoids some nasty melodic moves in the lower parts, and because it put a field shift in the upper part, so you can really hear that it's different. Now, this becomes very ambiguous. It could be interpreted as either of those 2 versions. I'll play it through in both ways twice to help your brain adjust. But there are other interpretations. We could just take it as on B half flat, and that puts us on the circle of 13th reverse, on our way to D. Or we could take G as the 10th degree and A as the 11th degree, and that gets us to E half flat. There's even more, but I think this makes the point, and I want to move on. As a side, I think that harmonic 13ths that allow more than one interpretation make field shifts a little smoother. As an example here, take a shift from C to C half flat. Kind of bong. Now let's do it using a harmonic 13th chord. In C, that harmonic 13th chord could be a harmonic 13th on 2, or an altered diminished 7th on 14. In C half flat, it could be a harmonic 13th on 9, or an altered diminished 7th a different way, also on 14. To my ears, that works out better. I'll go into more detail in a future episode, but I think that field shifts flow better when they use notes that can be interpreted as being on either field because of microtonal alterations. This chord is so flexible, you can take any two harmonic 13ths and find a number of strong connections between them. Can we just throw a whole bunch of random ones in sequence and get something musical out of it? None of the individual transitions sound wrong, but that does show the limits of extreme ambiguity. My brain can make sense out of the first four chords in there, but after that I start feeling like, what's going on? Although it is pretty cool that you can just take a couple of random chords and get something musical out of it. It's like a hook generator. So unless you want to write extremely ambiguous music, I have two suggestions to help keep listeners rooted. First, don't use too many harmonic 13ths in a row. 2 or 3 is a good limit. Throw in some less ambiguous chord to help indicate what the harmonic 13ths mean. Second, use strong, simple progressions. A great example of that is the circle of 11th from my previous episode. 23 harmonic 13ths in a row. But because there's a strong pattern that the listener can latch onto, it all flows fine and it sounds great. But even in that sequence, there are alternative interpretations you can pull out from this amazingly flexible chord. And to wrap up, I'll use some of those to do some of the Transfield modulations you were probably expecting. So we'll start with the chord on C, and then take 3 steps using harmonic 13ths on the root along the circle of 11ths. Then 1 more step back to a tonic triad. All very straightforward, very similar to the instant modulation of the previous episode. But we could interpret those harmonic 13th chords as 9/15 chords, also moving along the circle of 11ths, but on different roots. In that case, the last chord has a root of D, and the next step on the circle is A half flat. And that works too. And we can continue along using other interpretations and the same pattern. So, back to the circle as a 9/15 chord, 2 more steps, interpret that as a diminished 7th on A half flat, which makes the next chord in the sequence E flat, then back to the circle again, 2 more steps, interpret that as the other diminished 7th, and we can finally get to D half sharp. Four keys in four measures with every modulation a field shift, and it flows right along. What can I say? This chord is magic. Next episode, quarter-tone harmony without quarter tones. Impossible, you say? Well, if you want to see the impossible made possible, hit like, hit subscribe, and hit notify, and tune in next episode. Till then, keep making music and keep making a difference.